Have you ever heard of a millionaire who tied his prized thoroughbred to a tree, leaving it to a pack of wild wolves, only for the most unbelievable twist to unfold? In this thrilling tale, unexpected alliances and ancient mysteries come crashing into one man's relentless pursuit of power. If you want to unravel the secret behind why the wolves spared the thoroughbred and how a hardened businessman found his heart in the depths of the forest, be sure to watch till the end. Subscribe to this channel and stay tuned for more captivating stories. Your support helps us continue sharing these remarkable tales. Morgan Royce was the kind of man who wore his success like a second skin. From his tailored suits to the gleaming sports cars he collected, he left no doubt that he was a millionaire used to getting exactly what he wanted. He owned a sprawling estate at the edge of an ancient forest, a place most people avoided when night fell. Morgan, however, prided himself on not being superstitious. He saw the towering pines and twisting oaks as a picturesque backdrop to his luxurious home. Nothing more than trees and wildlife that posed no real threat to a man of his stature. He was convinced that nature existed to be tamed, and if it could not be tamed, it could at least be dominated. One cold evening, Morgan navigated his glossy black pickup truck down a narrow dirt road that cut through the forest's heart. The headlights illuminated twisting branches that seemed to reach out like skeletal arms. He drove carefully, less out of caution for the wilderness and more because he didn't want to dent his expensive vehicle. Behind him in a sturdy horse trailer stood the real object of his late-night venture, a magnificent chestnut thoroughbred named Solaris. Solaris had once represented a grand promise for Morgan, a prized racehorse meant to dominate the track. However, that promise had soured. A string of financial disputes and betrayals in Morgan's business circle had turned Solaris into a symbol of lost investments and personal humiliation. In Morgan's eyes, Solaris was a failure, a living emblem of everything he despised. Pride was everything to Morgan, and he hated nothing more than the reminder of a deal gone wrong. When the truck finally rumbled to a stop in a small clearing, the night air felt unnaturally cold. Morgan glanced around. The towering trees loomed ominously, their silhouettes wavering in the moonlight. He stepped out, slamming the truck door behind him. Gravel and frozen pine needles crunched underfoot as he walked to the trailer. Despite the crisp air, he was sweating. There was an urgency in his actions, a determination that bordered on desperation. He lowered the ramp and Solaris emerged. The horse stood tall, muscles tense, eyes darting at the shifting shadows cast by the truck's headlights. Solaris let out a low, anxious snort. If Morgan had a shred of empathy left in him, he might have paused to consider the animal's fear. But he did not. Instead, he tugged on the lead rope and muttered under his breath. "Quiet," Morgan hissed as he led Solaris deeper into the clearing. His gaze fixed on a gnarled, broad-trunked tree that stood alone in the center. Its bark was scarred and twisted, as though shaped by lightning strikes. Perhaps, Morgan thought, this was the perfect stage for his twisted spectacle. He pulled out a coarse rope from his jacket, ignoring the horse's trembling. Swiftly, he tied Solaris to the tree. The knots were tight. Morgan was skilled with knots from years of sailing on his private yacht. Stepping back, he stared at the horse with a sneer. "Let's see what the wolves do with you," Morgan muttered, flicking a glance at the darkness beyond the clearing. The forest was silent at first. Only a faint rustle of wind through the treetops disturbed the otherwise inky stillness. Solaris, now tied to the tree, pawed the ground, sending up small clouds of dust that glimmered in the moonlight. The horse snorted again, ears swiveling in an effort to detect the faintest sound of danger. Morgan, feeling a strange chill at the base of his neck, lit a cigarette. The orange tip flared, casting brief shadows across his stern features. He leaned against the trunk of a smaller nearby tree, half hidden from Solaris's view, and waited. He expected the wolves to appear quickly. Stories about packs roaming these parts of the forest were common among local hunters. That was, in fact, part of his plan. Morgan wanted Solaris gone, consumed by beasts of the wild, an end so brutal it would match his sense of betrayal. Though far from a nature enthusiast, Morgan had enough knowledge to understand how predators behaved. Wolves in this region were stealthy but direct once they had their sights on prey. They'd circle, test for weaknesses, and then strike. No drama, no hesitation. The irony of it all was not lost on him. He was counting on nature to do his dirty work, to rid him of a living reminder of his own failures. A faint, distant howl broke the silence, sending an electric jolt through both Morgan and Solaris. The horse jerked back, tugging on the rope. Morgan exhaled a cloud of smoke, a smug smile curling his lips. "That's it," he murmured. "Come and get Ed." He flicked the cigarette butt onto the ground, grinding it beneath his heel. Minutes passed. The wind carried another howl, closer this time. The night air felt heavier, the cold more biting. Solaris's breathing grew shallow, and he tossed his head, trying to see beyond the reach of the moonlight. Then, the first glint of golden eyes appeared between the black shapes of distant trees. One pair, then two, then three. A soft growl echoed, then died. From the darkness, wolves emerged, low-bodied shapes slipping into view. Their paws seemed to make no sound as they stepped over fallen branches and leaves. In the lead was an imposing figure, its fur streaked with silver scars. The alpha wolf, clearly. Morgan felt a flicker of excitement mingled with something else, an unease he refused to name. Solaris let out a desperate cry, hooves striking the ground in panic. The alpha wolf paused, its breath visible in the cold air, staring intently at the horse. Morgan waited for the chaos to erupt, the swirl of fur, fangs, and blood. He mentally steeled himself for the brutality. This was precisely what he had orchestrated, a savage execution in the wild, with no evidence leading back to him. But the killing frenzy never came. Instead, the alpha wolf stepped forward, sniffing the air. Its ears pricked up, and it looked almost curious, not at all like a creature about to rip into prey. It padded closer, coming within a stone's throw of Solaris, whose body quivered with fear. Morgan's sneer faltered as he witnessed the alpha wolf hesitate, studying the horse rather than attacking. For a long, tense moment, the alpha and Solaris locked eyes. The horse, despite its trembling, appeared to have found a strange resolve. Solaris did not attempt to bolt. The rope was tight anyway, but there was something in his stance, an odd acceptance that verged on defiance. The alpha wolf tilted its head as though puzzled by this reaction. Morgan stared, unable to process the odd tableau unfolding in front of him. He had anticipated a swift, brutal assault, not a standstill of mutual curiosity. The other wolves began to circle, their eyes reflecting in the moonlight, but they too seemed caught in the alpha's puzzling hesitation. His pulse pounding, Morgan took a step to the side, hoping to provoke a reaction. The crunch of leaves under his boots was louder than he intended. Several of the wolves shifted their gaze toward him. A low growl emanated from somewhere in the darkness, and Morgan felt a surge of panic. What if the wolves turned on him instead? He regretted not bringing a weapon more formidable than a small revolver stashed in his truck. However, the pack did not charge him. Instead, the alpha wolf huffed softly, a sound neither threatening nor friendly, before stepping back. The other wolves followed suit, as if guided by an unspoken command. Morgan watched in disbelief as the pack retreated into the tree line. The alpha turned its head one last time, eyes glowing with an expression that was almost knowing. Then it vanished into the shadows. A stunned silence settled. Solaris was still tied to the tree, breathing heavily, eyes wide, but undeniably alive. Morgan felt a cold sweat on his forehead. That was not how nature was supposed to behave. Wolves didn't hesitate. They seized opportunities. They were supposed to kill. Grimacing, Morgan walked back to his truck. He told himself he was merely giving the pack space, that perhaps they would return once he was gone. Yet doubt gnawed at him. Something was off, and he couldn't quite pin down what it was. The image of the alpha wolf's eyes lingered in his mind, refusing to give way to rational explanation. He climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and glanced once more at Solaris through the side mirror. The chestnut horse stood alone in the moonlit clearing, rope tied securely around the old trunk. Morgan wanted to believe it was just a fluke, that the wolves would come back when the headlights disappeared, but a strange unease festered inside him. Starting the engine, Morgan tried to shrug off his discomfort. He pressed down on the accelerator, the tires kicking up loose gravel. The truck's headlights carved twin beams through the thick forest until he made a sharp turn onto a dirt road that led away from the clearing. As the night swallowed him, Morgan whispered into the darkness, trying to sound certain. They'll finish him off. They have to. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Morgan's modern mansion. He had chosen the design specifically to emphasize his dominion over the natural surroundings, vast expanses of glass overlooking the wild forest he believed he controlled. But that morning, the grandeur felt hollow. Morgan stood on the balcony, gripping a porcelain mug of black coffee he had barely sipped. He had slept poorly. His dreams were haunted by the gleam in the alpha wolf's eyes and the eerie calm with which Solaris had faced the pack. The nightmares were disjointed, wolves howling under a blood-red moon, the silhouette of Solaris standing untouched, and a sense of ancient, pulsing energy that defied Morgan's strict adherence to logic. After setting the coffee mug aside, he paced the balcony. A swirl of doubts gnawed at him, interfering with his business-first mindset. He had built his fortune by forging quick decisions and never second-guessing himself. Yet here he was, consumed by the notion that something extraordinary had happened in that clearing. Evelyn, his longtime personal assistant, approached him cautiously. "Mr. Royce," she said, holding a sleek tablet, "the contractors want a decision on the new pool extension. They're expecting—" "Not now," Morgan snapped, barely glancing at her. His usual controlled demeanor had eroded. He wasn't sure why he felt such anger, only that the chaos in his mind needed an outlet. Evelyn's eyes flickered with concern, but she was too professional to pry. Morgan turned his back on her and stared once more at the forest. A question kept looping in his thoughts. What if Solaris was still alive? Logically, the horse should be long devoured. Wolves didn't leave potential meals behind, especially not a large, healthy horse. Unless they were scared off or had found an easier target, it made no sense. But something about the alpha's hesitation suggested it wasn't fear. He knew he wouldn't be able to focus on anything until he found out what had happened. Draining the last of his lukewarm coffee in one gulp, Morgan stormed inside, pulling on a leather jacket that hung by the front door. Ignoring Evelyn's queries about his schedule, he took his car keys and headed to the garage. Soon the shiny black pickup was winding down the same dirt road it had taken the night before. The morning sun lent the forest a softer glow, but that did nothing to soothe Morgan's unease. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, knuckles whitening as he replayed the events. When he reached the clearing, the engine's rumble dotted as he killed the ignition. The air felt unnaturally still. He stepped out cautiously, half expecting wolves to materialize from the underbrush. But instead, his heart nearly stopped at what he saw. Solaris, very much alive, still tied to that ancient, gnarled tree. The rope was frayed as though chewed, but still knotted enough to hold him. Solaris lifted his head as Morgan approached, ears twitching in clear recognition. The horse looked exhausted, but not wounded. There were no visible bites, no traces of a violent struggle. Morgan circled around, searching for any sign of blood or scuffle. Instead, he found tracks in the dirt, paw prints, multiple sets, leading around the tree in an almost deliberate formation. Morgan frowned, trying to piece it together. He crouched low, pressing a hand to one of the paw prints. The indentations were fresh, but suggested no frantic chase. It was as though the wolves had merely milled around, chewing at the rope but not finishing the job. Why would they chew through part of the rope and then leave the horse behind? The question gnawed at him, forming a knot of frustration and confusion in his gut. The tension in the clearing had not dissipated with the daylight. If anything, it felt more potent. Morgan could almost sense eyes on him, as if hidden watchers lurked among the trees. He swallowed hard. Maybe it was paranoia, but he couldn't shake the suspicion that the forest was observing him. Solaris snorted, tugging on the rope. Morgan hesitated. A rational part of him said, "Just get out of here. Shoot the horse if you must. End this now." But another part, one that he rarely acknowledged, stirred with an uncomfortable sense of curiosity. There was no logical explanation for the wolves' odd behavior. Animals, especially predators, acted on instinct. Nothing about the night before that fit that narrative. Gritting his teeth, Morgan rummaged in the pocket of his jacket for a small folding knife. With practiced efficiency, he cut the rope. Solaris jerked backward for an instant, then stilled, as though waiting for some command. Morgan tested the air, half expecting the wolves to surge out of the tree line at any moment, but the forest remained silent. Unwilling to linger, Morgan led Solaris toward the truck. The horse walked obediently, a stark contrast to the panicked creature that had been dragged into the clearing the previous night. If there was any fear left, Solaris concealed it well. Once in the trailer, the horse stood unmoving, his gaze seemingly fixed on the receding forest as Morgan drove away. Morgan caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror and felt another shiver of unease. Why did I even bother to bring him back? He tried to justify it as wanting to keep a potential asset alive. After all, Solaris was still a valuable animal, if only for breeding. But the truth poked at him from a dark corner of his mind. He couldn't leave this mystery unsolved. All the way back to the estate, Morgan couldn't banish the thought that something was fundamentally off. It was as though the forest, and its wolves, had allowed him to reclaim Solaris, like a strange, silent pact he'd never agreed to, but was now a part of. Morgan's estate featured a large barn built to house thoroughbreds back when he first purchased Solaris and several other racehorses. Over time, his interest shifted more toward flashy business ventures than horse racing, and the barn was left mostly empty. Still, it was immaculate, maintained by a skeleton crew he hired to keep up appearances. After parking, Morgan walked Solaris to the open-air stable. The horse obeyed without protest, though his large brown eyes were alert, scanning everything from the polished floors to the shadowy rafters. Morgan paused at an empty stall, gesturing for Solaris to enter. The horse complied, turning slowly to face him from behind the wooden half-door. Evelyn was waiting outside, tablet clutched to her chest. She took one look at Solaris and then at Morgan. "I thought you got rid of him," she said, failing to hide her surprise. Morgan frowned. "Change of plans," he grumbled. "Have the groom bring some fresh hay and water. He'll need a checkup, too." She nodded, tapped a few notes on her device, and asked, "Shall I schedule a vet?" "Not yet," Morgan replied, removing his jacket and draping it over a nearby hook. "I'll handle it myself for now." Evelyn left, though her puzzled expression made it clear she wanted to ask more questions. Morgan turned back to face Solaris, who stood still, ears flicking in mild curiosity. The faintest sense of relief trickled through Morgan. He never expected to feel relieved about the horse's safety, but there it was. Slipping into the stall, Morgan ran a hand along Solaris's flank. The horse didn't flinch. Instead, Solaris leaned into the touch as though craving reassurance. Morgan's mind replayed the moment the alpha wolf had hesitated, the haunting vision of an inevitable kill that never happened. He couldn't shake the notion that Solaris had some role in this that went beyond sheer luck. He was tempted to dismiss the entire episode as a bizarre anomaly, but each time he tried, his memory of the clearing refused to fade. There had been a feeling in that place, a heavy, pulsing energy in the air. And the wolves. He could still see the alpha's eyes, not filled with hunger, but with an uncanny scrutiny. Sighing, Morgan left Solaris with one of the stable workers and retreated to his office in the mansion. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a sweeping view of the forest, whose trees swayed softly in the midday sun. He poured himself a glass of water, downing it in one gulp. His thoughts felt jumbled, everything colored by the unsettling events he'd witnessed. Even behind the safety of glass and steel, he sensed that the forest was too close. The lines between his controlled world and the wild realm beyond it were starting to blur. He found himself stepping back from the window, uneasy with how the trees seemed to beckon. That night, sleep remained elusive. Morgan tossed and turned, his expensive silk sheets offering no comfort. Each time he closed his eyes, the same scene replayed. The alpha wolf standing before Solaris, something unspoken passing between them. He tried to tell himself it was madness, that animals didn't communicate the way humans did. Yet that nagging feeling wouldn't leave him alone. At around 3 in the morning, he gave up on trying to rest. He threw on a robe and paced through the hallways of his mansion, the motion sensor lights flickering on and off, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. He ended up in his study, a room dominated by dark wooden shelves lined with business books and trophies from his various ventures. From the large window, he could see the silhouette of the barn. A faint lantern glow flickered within, indicating that one of the stable workers might still be around. Or perhaps it was just the security lights. Regardless, Morgan found himself drawn outside. The cold air was bracing as he stepped onto the gravel path. His slippers crunched softly with each step toward the barn. He found the lantern, but no stable hand. Solaris, however, was awake, his head peering over the stall door. His ears flicked at Morgan's approach. For reasons he couldn't fully articulate, Morgan opened the stall door and stepped inside. Solaris exhaled a warm breath that smelled faintly of hay. In the stillness, The horse's steady presence was oddly soothing. Morgan gently placed a hand on Solaris's neck. "Weedy," he murmured. "Why didn't they hurt you?" As if in reply, Solaris stirred, a subtle shift of weight and a light nudge against Morgan's arm. Morgan stood there for several minutes, simply listening to the horse's breathing. Then, in the distance, through the barn's open doorway, he heard it. A howl. It was distant but unmistakable. His pulse kicked up. The sound was more than a simple cry of a wolf. It carried an echo of the forest's ancient mystery, a call that seemed to crawl under his skin. Solaris's ears perked, and Morgan felt the horse's muscles tense. The horse recognized it too. Morgan quickly shut the barn door, as though that thin layer of wood could keep out whatever power that howl represented. He hurried back to the mansion, heart pounding like he'd just sprinted a mile. Once inside, he locked every door, every window, and double-checked the security system. But none of it eased the dread coiling in his stomach. As he sank onto a couch in the living room, he stared at the reflections in the tall glass windows. The trees swayed, and for an instant, he thought he saw a pair of glowing eyes in the distance. Blinking, he realized it was likely just a trick of light, but the howling continued softly somewhere in the night, and Morgan Royce could not shake the feeling that it was meant for him, an invitation or perhaps a warning. Dawn broke over the Royce estate with a pale, hesitant light. Morgan had finally dozed off in the early hours, slumped on his living room couch, but the rising sun roused him with merciless persistence. His back ached, and his mind felt as murky as the mist clinging to the treetops outside. He washed down 2 aspirin with cold water and stood at the massive windows, gazing out at the forest with renewed apprehension. He realized with unsettling clarity that he couldn't ignore what had happened with Solaris and the wolves. He had tried to dismiss the memory as some bizarre stroke of luck or a momentary lapse in predatory instinct. But the haunted expression of the alpha wolf, if one could call an animal's face haunted, and the echoing howl from last night would not leave him. There was a pull in that forest, and it reached him even here, in this fortress of steel, glass, and wealth. By the time Morgan walked out to the barn, his plan was already half-formed. The stable worker on duty nodded politely, stepping aside as Morgan approached Solaris's stall. The horse greeted him with a gentle nicker, brown eyes bright and alert. No longer the same anxious animal that had once danced nervously at the edge of Morgan's hold, Solaris now seemed calm, confident even. Morgan wondered what this transformation might mean. In the past, Solaris had possessed a certain spirited quality, but it often manifested as jitters when confronted with anything unfamiliar. After that night in the clearing, however, Solaris carried himself differently, steadier, like he understood a secret that Morgan was struggling to grasp. Closing the stall door behind him, Morgan ran a hand through Solaris's mane. "I'm going back," he muttered, voice echoing slightly off the barn walls. He wasn't entirely sure whether he was talking to himself or the horse, but either way he felt compelled to speak. "Something happened out there, and I can't let it lie." He had no idea what he expected to find. Maybe the wolves would appear again, behaving just as strangely. Perhaps he would discover fresh tracks, some sign that the pack had returned to that same clearing. Either way, he wouldn't know until he saw for himself. Leading Solaris out of the stall, Morgan prepared the trailer just as he had 2 days prior. His movements were brisk but tinged with nervous energy. He checked the trailer hitch twice, ensuring it was secure. Though a voice in the back of his mind whispered, "This is madness," he couldn't stop himself. Evelyn watched from a distance, her expression betraying concern. She rarely saw Morgan handle the trailer equipment himself. He normally delegated that to hired help. But she remained silent, knowing better than to question him when he was in one of his fixations. Once Solaris was loaded, Morgan climbed into the truck, exhaling a long, shaky breath. The sky was turning from pale to bright, painting the forest edges in gold and green. With a sense of grim purpose, he started the engine, determined to confront whatever secret lay hidden beneath those towering branches. Morgan maneuvered the truck along the winding dirt road, the trailer rattling behind him. With each mile, the forest thickened, tall pines and rugged oaks forming a near impenetrable wall on either side. A swallow of dread rose in his throat when the trees began to look familiar. It was only mid-morning, but the canopy overhead filtered out much of the sunlight, casting long, warped shadows. The hush that descended as he neared the clearing felt unnatural, a quiet that seemed to be waiting. He parked at the same spot as before, killed the engine, and lingered in the driver's seat for a few seconds, heart pounding. When he finally stepped down onto the forest floor, the cool air hit him like a slap. He walked to the back of the trailer, lowered the ramp, and guided Solaris onto the soft ground. The horse tossed his head, nostrils flaring, as if picking up a scent that Morgan could not. For a moment, Morgan wondered if they should even proceed. That primal part of him, dedicated to self-preservation, screamed that entering the domain of wolves with a horse in tow was madness. But the curiosity burned stronger. He led Solaris into the clearing where he had tied the horse previously. The ancient tree still bore the faint scars of the rope. A ghostly hush clung to the area, as though the forest itself remembered what transpired here. Morgan half expected the pack to materialize, circling them the way they had on that fateful night. But no glowing eyes appeared from the shadows. No menacing growls. A breeze rustled the leaves overhead, drawing Morgan's gaze skyward. He frowned, scanning the tree line until his eyes settled on a dark shape moving in the distance. It seemed to flash between the boles of the pines, then vanish, leaving him uncertain if he'd imagined it. Solaris shifted restlessly, letting out a low snort. Morgan's pulse hammered. A part of him wanted the wolves to show themselves. He needed answers. But when the shapes remained elusive, he decided to push deeper into the woods. Perhaps the pack was nearby, just beyond the clearing's perimeter. Leading Solaris by the rope, Morgan ventured past the clearing's boundary. The forest seemed to close around them, branches forming a tight canopy that filters out all but the faintest sunlight. Old-growth trees towered overhead, their thick trunks draped in moss. Underfoot, the ground grew soft with layers of fallen needles and leaves. The deeper they went, the more Morgan felt an odd pressure in the air. It was subtle at first, like the distant hum of electricity, but it grew with each step. Solaris pricked his ears, letting out a small, uneasy sound. Morgan paused, glancing in all directions, searching for movement. Nothing. Only that charged stillness, a strange hush that felt both foreboding and expectant. Suddenly, a flicker of gray caught Morgan's eye. A wolf, smaller than the alpha but still formidable, stepped out from behind a wide oak trunk. Its golden eyes were locked onto Morgan and Solaris, unblinking. Morgan's heart lurched. He tightened his grip on the rope, as if that meager line could protect them. The wolf did not snarl or crouch, showing no immediate sign of aggression. Instead, it stood perfectly still, as though deciding what to do next. Morgan wished he had brought something more than the small hunting knife tucked into his belt. But then again, he was here for answers, not a fight. The stalemate lasted a few seconds before the wolf emitted a low, throaty sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a bark, something in between. The hair on Morgan's neck stood on end. He felt vulnerable, with the dense forest pressing in on all sides. Then, to his surprise, the wolf turned and began walking away, pausing once to look back over its shoulder. It was an unmistakable gesture, like a guide waiting for its followers. Morgan's mind balked at the notion of following a wolf. The idea was absurd, yet he found himself moving as though compelled. Solaris didn't resist either, only flicked his ears as if something unspoken told him to comply. They wound their way deeper, guided by the wolf's fleeting shape. Occasionally, it disappeared behind thick clusters of undergrowth, reappearing a moment later, ensuring Morgan and Solaris stayed on its track. The forest undergrowth became a labyrinth of twisting roots and decaying logs. Morgan stumbled once or twice but managed to keep up. During the trek, he caught glimpses of other wolves flitting through the shadows, though they never approached directly. He recognized some from the night of the clearing, the same sleek forms, the same shining eyes. He still didn't see the alpha wolf, just these watchers, whose presence felt oddly protective rather than predatory. The tension in Morgan's chest ebbed slightly. This was surreal, but it did not feel like a trap. It was more like a summons, though he couldn't guess for what purpose. A memory of a half-forgotten childhood fable flickered in his mind. Stories of wolves leading travelers to hidden glens where secrets lay buried. Back then, he'd scoffed at such fantasies. He was a man of business, deals, and figures. Yet here he was, following a wolf into uncharted depths of an ancient forest. Suddenly, the trees thinned, revealing another clearing. At its center, a large, flat stone jutted out of the earth, partially covered in moss. Strange symbols, intricate patterns and shapes were carved into its surface. Morgan halted, his mouth going dry. The wolf that led him stepped aside, clearing a path to the stone. Solaris stomped a hoof, ears perked and eyes fixed on the stone. There was a palpable hum in the air, a vibration Morgan felt deep in his bones. He swallowed hard. Something told him that this place was alive with more than just the rustle of leaves and the presence of wolves. For a moment, Morgan stood frozen, uncertain whether to approach. The carved stone at the clearing's center seemed to pulse with subdued energy. Even the surrounding wolves, now gathering at the edges, remained still, as if waiting for a ceremony to begin. The leading wolf padded closer to the stone, then looked back at Morgan again, silently prompting him to advance. Solaris tossed his head but made no move to back away. Taking a breath that quivered with tension, Morgan led the horse forward. Each step felt momentous, as if he were crossing an invisible threshold. When he was close enough to touch the stone, he noticed the carvings in stark detail. Lines and symbols twisting in geometric patterns that almost looked alive. Some resembled animals, a wolf's head, the outline of a horse in motion. Others were unfamiliar runes that defied instant comprehension. The moss around them glistened with dew, and the entire surface had an otherworldly sheen under the filtered daylight. Morgan reached out a tentative hand. Just before his fingertips grazed the stone, he hesitated. A primal fear surged within him, warning him off, as though touching it would unravel something he wasn't ready to face. But another part of him, the part that had driven him to return, insisted he must. His skin made contact with the cold rock, and a surge of energy rushed up his arm. It was not painful, but it rattled him to his core, as if an electric current were passing from the stone into his veins. He staggered, and Solaris whinnied in alarm. Morgan's vision blurred. Colors swirled and coalesced into incomprehensible shapes. He saw flashes of wolves galloping through moonlit forests, of horses running alongside them without fear. Trees changed with the seasons. Ancient civilizations rose and fell, and through it all, that stone remained a silent witness. At the center of these visions was a recurring theme: unity, wolves and horses, predator and prey, moving in a delicate balance. Humans, too, were part of it. Once, one. Morgan's heart raced, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of impressions. It was as if he were receiving centuries' worth of memories compressed into a single blinding instant. He gasped, jerking his hand away. The moment contact broke, the vision ceased. His legs felt unsteady, and he stumbled backward, only maintaining balance by gripping Solaris's mane. The horse nudged him, steadying his position. Chest heaving, Morgan looked around. The wolves watched him with keen interest, their stances neither threatening nor relaxed, something in between. The leading wolf, a smaller gray one, not the alpha, sat quietly beside the stone, tail curled around its paws. Morgan tried to speak, but no words emerged. He wondered how such a place had remained hidden so close to his estate. This wasn't just a relic from old legends, it was something alive. Through ragged breaths, Morgan sensed that whatever he had just glimpsed was a fragment of a far older tapestry, one that now claimed him as a participant rather than a mere observer. The wolves began to move, and for a tense moment Morgan feared an attack. But they dispersed, trotting into the trees, leaving just two behind: the gray wolf who had led him here, and another younger, smaller wolf with dark fur. The dark-furred one emitted a brief whine, looking from Morgan to Solaris, then followed the others into the forest. The gray wolf lingered, eyes reflecting a quiet intelligence. Then, with a final look, it too vanished. Silence engulfed the clearing. The stone's faint glow subsided, returning to a more ordinary shade of ancient gray veined with moss. Morgan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the forest's hush. Solaris shook his mane and blew out a loud breath, almost as if to say, "Well, that happened." Morgan collapsed to one knee, head spinning. What had he seen? Were they visions of the pond or some mystical revelation? He recalled glimpses of people and animals coexisting, a relationship far beyond the simple predator-prey dynamic. The horse, the wolves, and the humans had once been linked by a powerful bond of necessity and respect. He thought about how he had spent his entire life bending situations to his benefit, acquisitions, deals, even living creatures like Solaris. Yet here he stood before something he couldn't buy, bully, or reason away. A primal force beyond logic or currency. Gradually he composed himself enough to rise. The emptiness of the clearing felt almost oppressive now. Even the swirl of energy that had enveloped him moments ago was gone, leaving him unmoored. Without the wolf's watchful eyes, he felt small and oddly abandoned. He approached the stone again, more cautiously this time, as though it might unleash another torrent of images. This close, the carvings seemed faint and unremarkable, except for one small symbol near the center that he hadn't noticed before. It looked like two concentric circles with lines branching out, reminiscent of a sun, but also vaguely like an eye. He ran his finger over it lightly, but no fresh vision came. Reeling from the strangeness of it all, Morgan led Solaris away. He had to get back to the estate, to think this through and decide what to do next. For all his wealth and cunning, he was ill-prepared for a revelation of this magnitude. Questions swarmed him. What had the wolves wanted him to see? Why Solaris? And why that stone? He looked over his shoulder as he and the horse re-entered the thick forest. The clearing's entrance quickly disappeared behind leaves and branches, as if the place itself refused to be seen by outsiders. Morgan wondered how many people, if any, had stumbled upon that stone before him. If they had, they must have left forever changed, just as he was now. Somewhere in the distance, a lone howl echoed, low and resonant, but it sounded less like a threat and more like a lament. Morgan pressed forward, gripping the lead rope. A newfound sense of unease and wonder fueled his every step. Back at the estate, Morgan tried to slip in quietly, as if normalcy would cloak the surreal events he'd just experienced. But his disheveled appearance and the dried leaves stuck to his boots did not go unnoticed. A stable worker gawked when Morgan returned with Solaris, coated in bits of forest debris, twigs snagged in the horse's mane. Morgan barked a brusque order to fetch fresh water, doing his best to maintain an air of authority. Evelyn found him in the barn shortly after. She always seemed to materialize precisely when she was needed, and from Morgan's perspective, precisely when he wanted to be left alone. "I've been rescheduling your meetings," she informed him, glancing nervously at his sweat-drenched shirt. "I assumed you were busy." Morgan let out a humorless laugh. "You could say that. He paused, unsure how to explain. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, but Morgan could see she was genuinely worried. She glanced at Solaris, who was calmly sipping water from a large bucket. "He seems all right," she offered. "You sure you're okay?" "I'm fine," Morgan snapped, then softened. He realized his voice had been sharper than intended. "I'm just exhausted. It's been a long day." Evelyn studied him for a moment, clearly wanting to say more, but choosing to bite her tongue. With a curt nod, she left to handle another round of phone calls and messages. Morgan couldn't blame her for being perplexed. He was usually so collected, so methodical in his business dealings. Now he lurked around the barn at odd hours, returning from the forest with some bizarre, haunted look in his eyes. After stripping off his jacket, Morgan grabbed a brush and began grooming Solaris, letting the repetitive motion soothe his nerves. He swept away dried mud and leaves, feeling each muscle ripple beneath the horse's coat. Despite Morgan's physical and mental fatigue, Solaris's calm presence was oddly reassuring. As his thoughts drifted, he found himself replaying the images from the stone's visions. He recalled the impression of time folding in on itself, wolves, horses, and humans bound by something intangible, yet deeply powerful. At no point did he see violence or fear in those flashes, only a profound unity that transcended the barriers of speech and species. It stood in stark contrast to his entire approach to life thus far. He had always seen the world as a series of conquests, property to acquire, animals to harness, people to outmaneuver. Now it seemed there was a dimension he had never even considered. Finishing the grooming, Morgan gave Solaris one last pat and headed for the exit. The barn door closed behind him with a soft creak. Outside, the forest loomed as a dark wall, silent and inscrutable. With a shiver, Morgan realized that the sensation of being watched persisted. Whether by wolves or by something else, he couldn't say. For the first time, his estate felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage on the edge of a far greater mystery. Night came swiftly, bringing with it a thin slice of moon that glowed over the treetops. Morgan retreated to his study, lights dimmed, to wrestle with his conflicting emotions. He flipped through a stack of project proposals, trying to focus on acquisitions and spreadsheets, but each column of figures drifted in and out of focus. Scenes from the forest intruded, superimposing themselves on the black and white text. He finally shoved the papers aside. The tension in his chest had become unbearable, a physical ache that demanded relief. Rising from his desk, he walked to the window and stared out at the forest silhouette. Even at this late hour, he sensed that electric hum in the air, the same presence he'd felt in the stone's clearing. Before he could talk himself out of it, Morgan grabbed a flashlight and left the mansion. He strode across the manicured lawn, past the barn where Solaris dozed peacefully, and onto the path that led to the forest. The estate's floodlights gave way to the moon's pale glow, and soon he was enveloped in shadows. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing thick trunks and trailing vines. The night was alive with subtle sounds, a rustle of leaves, the faint chitter of nocturnal creatures. He intended only to step inside a short way, to see if the forest felt as oppressive by night as it did by day. But the undergrowth seemed to beckon, pulling him deeper. Each footstep felt laden with significance, as though he were trespassing on sacred ground. Memories of the stone clearing and the wolves pressed upon him. Was he hoping for another vision? Some further clue to unravel the purpose behind these strange events? After what felt like an hour, he reached a spot where the trees thinned slightly, allowing moonlight to cascade down. He paused to catch his breath, shining the flashlight in a slow circle. That's when he saw them, two small points of light reflecting back at him from the underbrush. His pulse spiked, and he instinctively swung the beam away, half afraid of provoking whatever creature lurked there. But a soft growl, low, uncertain, followed. Morgan steeled himself, inching the flashlight back toward the eyes. A young wolf, not fully grown, emerged from behind a cluster of ferns. Its ears were flattened, and its posture was tense, neither fully aggressive nor frightened. Morgan froze, heart thumping. The wolf stared back at him, head tilted. It let out a short, muffled whine. For a moment, man and animal regarded each other across a small clearing, lit by moonlight in the artificial glare of a flashlight. The wolf took a hesitant step forward, nose quivering at the air. Then an echoing howl rang from deeper in the woods, the alpha's call, perhaps. The young wolf's head jerked in that direction, and it made an urgent yip, as if replying. Within seconds, it vanished into the shadowed foliage, leaving Morgan alone with the pounding of his own heartbeat. He didn't know how long he stood there before forcing himself to turn back. But as he retraced his steps to the mansion, flashlight shaking in his grip, Morgan realized something vital. The forest was not just calling him, it was welcoming him, bit by bit, into a realm he had never imagined. Into a realm he had. Morgan barely slept after that night. Each time he closed his eyes, images of the young wolf's cautious gaze and the echoing howl jolted him awake. It felt as though his mind was caught between two worlds. The one he had meticulously built through business acumen and wealth, and the primordial realm just beyond his estate's manicured lawns. By sunrise, he had paced the length of his mansion so many times that the motion-activated lights flicked on an apology rather than alarm. Determined to break free from the fight of his own thoughts, Morgan dressed and went to check on Solaris at first light. The barn was quiet, the stable workers not yet on duty. To his relief, the horse was resting calmly. His ears flicked in mild acknowledgement when Morgan approached, as if noting the man's restless energy. Morgan stroked Solaris's neck, and once more the horse's presence felt like an anchor. He decided to spend the morning tending to mundane tasks, emails, phone calls, and scheduling. But every time his eyes drifted toward the forest beyond the windows, a disquieting surge of adrenaline rippled through him. The sense of being watched hadn't diminished. If anything, it had intensified, as though unseen eyes from the tree line held him under constant scrutiny. Before midday, he received a call from a longtime business partner inquiring about a new development project. Normally, Morgan thrived on such conversations. He relished every strategic detail. But now his mind was adrift. While the voice on the other end of the line spoke excitedly about property zoning and potential profits, Morgan's attention drifted out the window to the flicker of leaves in the distance. Yes, yes, I'll review the documents, he said absently, hardly processing his own words. The call ended, and he realized with a jolt that he could barely recall any specifics of the conversation. That had never happened before. At lunch, he discovered he wasn't hungry. He picked at a salad Evelyn had ordered in, scanning updates on his phone without retaining anything he read. Twice, he found himself scrolling through pictures of ancient ruins and petroglyphs, as if searching for something that resembled the mysterious carvings on the stone in the forest. He found no exact match, only vague references to prehistoric cultures and old legends linking animals and humans under shared beliefs. After hours of feigned work, Morgan could stand it no more. He rose from his desk, ignoring the half-dozen messages blinking on his computer screen. Slipping on a lightweight jacket, he marched outside, drawn inevitably to the barn. Perhaps being near Solaris might bring clarity or quell the anxious energy coursing through him. Yet as he stepped into the barn's dim interior, a thought solidified in his mind. No matter how he tried to confine himself to the routine of his estate, the forest refused to be ignored. Something there demanded his attention, and until he confronted it fully, he would be trapped in this restless limbo between the civilized world he had mastered and the ancient realm that beckoned. Morgan found Solaris already saddled by one of the stable hands who had guessed correctly that the horse might be exercised today. Although Morgan rarely rode anymore, the staff occasionally kept Solaris in readiness, just in case. Surprised but oddly grateful, Morgan led the horse outside without a word. He mounted up, inhaling the scent of leather and fresh hay. The feel of being on Solaris's back was a forgotten comfort, one that took him back to a time before wealth had overshadowed simple pleasures. Solitude blanketed the estate's grounds. Evelyn was off handling various tasks, and any lingering staff members had enough sense not to question Morgan's intentions. Even if they'd asked, Morgan wasn't sure how he would explain riding directly toward the forest line, drawn by a force he could neither name nor resist. Approaching the trees, he noticed how Solaris responded. The horse flicked his ears forward, gait becoming almost enthusiastic, as though sharing Morgan's urgency. The boundary between manicured lawn and wild underbrush felt like crossing into another dimension. The air grew cooler, tinted with the aroma of pine and damp earth. Overhanging branches filtered out the midday sun, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. Morgan guided Solaris along a path that veered away from the clearing where he had first tied the horse. Something else was drawing him deeper today, a subtle pull akin to gravity. He remembered the labyrinth of trails he had discovered when following the wolves. He turned Solaris in that direction, letting intuition guide them more than any conscious map. The ride was both exhilarating and tense. Each snap of a twig, each rustle of leaves, sent a spark of adrenaline through Morgan. He scanned the woods for movement. Was the alpha wolf out there, observing him? Or perhaps the young wolf he had encountered? But the forest offered no direct sign of its denizens. It only enveloped him in layers of mystery. Branches that reached overhead like a cathedral ceiling, mossy rocks that glimmered in streaks of sunlight, and the occasional flutter of birds retreating from the hoofbeats. At last, the trees began to thin, and Morgan recognized an outcropping of jagged stones. A tingle of déjà vu coursed through him. He realized this was near the clearing with the flat stone, where he had experienced those powerful visions. Though the precise route was different, the forest had led him here again, whether by chance or design. Heart thudding, he guided Solaris forward until they broke into the clearing's boundary. The moss-covered stone still stood at its center, emanating a hushed aura. Morgan dismounted, tethering Solaris to a nearby branch that was sturdy but allowed the horse some freedom of movement. Then he approached the stone on foot, a simmering apprehension pulsing in his veins. No wolves materialized, but the clearing felt far from empty. The air was charged, as though countless eyes peered from unseen vantage points in the undergrowth. Morgan swallowed, remembering how it had felt to place his hand on that carved surface, and how the rush of images had nearly overwhelmed him. Determined not to be caught off guard, Morgan approached the stone with deliberate caution. He circled around it first, studying the carvings in the subdued daylight. The runes and symbols still baffled him. Certain patterns resembled spirals or labyrinths. Others suggested stylized animals, a wolf's silhouette here, a horse's head there. The faint suggestion of human figures appeared in places, often positioned beside the animals as if in partnership. His gaze settled on the small symbol near the center, the one he had touched before. Two concentric circles with radiating lines, a shape that could be an eye, a sun, or something else entirely. Morgan crouched to examine it more closely. The stone was cold to the touch, yet he felt a subtle buzzing beneath his fingertips, like subdued electricity. A wild urge overcame him to place both palms against the stone, to confront the images head-on, to see if this ancient artifact would reveal more of its story. But he hesitated, recalling how disorienting the first vision had been. He wasn't certain he could endure another flood of revelations if it proved more intense than before. He drew a deep breath and pressed his hands flat against the stone's surface. At first, there was only silence. Disappointment flickered in him. Then a low thrumming resonated, vibrating through his bones. His vision blurred and a jarring swirl of colors enveloped him once more. This time the images came slower, more coherent, as though the stone recognized him. He saw flashes of wolves running in ghostly arcs, their forms overlapping with an older time. Ancient forests, star-laden skies untouched by modern lights. Horses galloped beside them, free of saddles, manes whipping in the wind. In the background, humans appeared, not in carriages or on hunts, but walking among wolves and horses with reverence. Emotions welled inside Morgan, respect, awe, and a raw sense of unity. He felt the forest breathe as if it were a single living organism. Wolves, horses, and humans each held a place in its grand design. No single creature dominated. All thrived in a careful, sacred balance. A final image lingered, a faint silhouette that might have been a man standing at the stone, arms raised to the sky, with wolves at his left and horses at his right. There was a sense of an oath taken or a role accepted. Suddenly the vision wavered, replaced by the sight of a wolf's intense golden eyes, filled with something akin to expectation. Then the stone released him, and Morgan stumbled backward, gasping as he blinked away the kaleidoscope of shapes. His heart hammered, and sweat matted his hairline. He squinted at the stone, half expecting it to glow or shift, but it remained unmoving and ancient, a silent keeper of its secrets. Dizzy, Morgan sank to the ground. Solaris nickered softly from where he was tied, perhaps sensing the turbulence in Morgan's spirit. Overhead, branches whispered in a breeze, and Morgan felt tears burn unbidden at the corners of his eyes. He couldn't articulate why. Perhaps the visions had stirred something buried, an ache for a world he had never known but now desperately yearned to protect. Morgan was still kneeling beside the stone when he heard a rustling from the forest's edge. Alarm shot through him, but the adrenaline soon eased into a guarded calm as he spotted movement among the trees. Wolves emerged, moving in near silence. The same scarred alpha he'd first seen in the clearing appeared at their forefront. Morgan's breath caught. He had nearly convinced himself that these creatures were illusions of his own overwrought mind. Now their presence was undeniable. The alpha wolf stepped into the clearing with deliberate, measured strides. Its eyes locked onto Morgan, who felt rooted to the spot, as though any sudden movement might break a fragile truce. Behind the alpha, half a dozen wolves fanned out in an arc, forming a watchful semicircle near the stone. Though fear tightened Morgan's chest, he sensed no immediate threat. The wolves' posture was not aggressive. They carried themselves more like sentinels guarding a threshold. Memories of the visions he'd just experienced fluttered in his mind. Wolves and horses, humans too, woven into a tapestry of mutual respect. Solaris remained where he was, ears pricked, but otherwise unafraid. The alpha wolf's gaze flicked momentarily to the horse, then settled back on Morgan. A chill trickled down Morgan's spine. Those golden eyes held a familiarity, as if the alpha already understood far more about him than any normal beast could. Morgan slowly rose to his feet, cautious not to make sudden gestures. His shirt was damp with sweat, and he became acutely aware of every rustle of cloth, every breath. One of the wolves near the alpha emitted a low rumble that was neither a growl nor a whine, a sound of recognition, perhaps. Against all logic, Morgan felt compelled to speak. His voice shook. I'm not here to harm you, he managed, though the statement felt woefully inadequate. The alpha wolf cocked its head, as if listening. An uneasy silence stretched. Then, in a movement so swift Morgan barely registered it, the alpha wolf padded closer until it stood just a few feet away. Morgan's pulse thundered. He could see each scar in the wolf's coarse fur, each ripple of muscle. One snap of those jaws could tear flesh from bone. Yet the wolf did not attack. Instead, it sniffed the air near Morgan's hand, where the faint residue of the stone's energy still seemed to cling. Morgan dared not flinch. His eyes darted to the side, noticing another wolf had approached Solaris. The horse stood steady, ears twitching, but not panicked. It was then Morgan realized the same perplexing dance was unfolding as that first night. Predator and prey existed side by side without violence, except now it was happening with him present, almost as if he were part of the ritual. A trembling exhale escaped Morgan's lips. The alpha wolf inhaled, then released a soft, low huff, a sound that conveyed neither menace nor submission. If anything, it was a sign of reluctant acceptance. Stepping back, the alpha regarded Morgan once more, then turned toward the trees. The alpha wolf trotted toward the forest edge, pausing to look back as though beckoning Morgan to follow. All around, the other wolves melted into the undergrowth, their sleek forms slipping effortlessly between branches. Morgan's heart pounded. He glanced at Solaris, unsure whether to leave the horse alone in this clearing. But Solaris's calm bearing reassured him. The horse appeared oddly at ease with the wolf's presence. Morgan took a faltering step, then another, drawn along by a surge of inexplicable trust. It was the same pull he had felt when the gray wolf had guided him to the stone, an almost magnetic summons that defied everything he knew about how animals should behave. His rational mind railed against it, but deeper instincts nudged him forward. Beyond the clearing, the terrain sloped gently downward, the underbrush thick with ferns and wildflowers. The alpha wolf moved at a measured pace, glancing occasionally over its shoulder as if ensuring Morgan was still there. He followed awkwardly, trying not to trip over protruding roots. His chest constricted with tension, yet an undercurrent of exhilaration coursed through him. They passed fallen logs draped in moss, trickling streams that cut meandering paths through the forest floor. Shafts of light broke through the canopy in slender columns, illuminating floating dust motes. Once, Morgan paused to catch his breath, and the alpha waited, offering him an inscrutable stare. After several minutes, they reached a glen nestled amid towering pines. There, in a small sunlit patch, the rest of the pack awaited. Wolves lounged on the grass or sniffed at the edges of a shallow creek. Morgan's arrival caused a brief stir. Some lifted their heads, ears perked, before settling into watchful stillness. At the center of this gathering lay something unexpected. A young fawn, obviously injured but still alive, breathing in shallow, uneven gasps. Morgan's stomach nodded. Was this the pack's intended meal? The sight of the wounded creature stirred pity in him, yet he also felt a wave of dread. Was he about to witness a kill? To his astonishment, the wolves didn't lunge. Instead, the scarred alpha approached the fawn, sniffed gently around its injured hind leg, then backed away with a soft whine. One of the subordinate wolves circled closer, as if hoping to feed, but the alpha snapped a warning. Confusion rippled through Morgan. This defied all logic. Why guard injured prey instead of finishing it off? With trembling caution, Morgan moved forward. He could see that the fawn's leg was twisted in a way that made him suspect a break. A stray bullet or a vehicle collision? Or perhaps a snare trap from a poacher? He couldn't be sure. The fawn's eyes rolled in panic at his approach, but it was too weak to bolt. Heart pounding, he glanced at the alpha. The wolf made no move to stop him. In fact, the entire pack seemed to watch him with an expectant stillness. Gingerly, Morgan knelt by the fawn. The raw emotion of the moment overwhelmed him, a perfect reflection of those visions. Predator and prey, man and beast, all in one shared space, bound by something deeper than survival. Time slowed as Morgan tried to assess the fawn's injury. He knew very little about veterinary medicine, but seeing the creature suffer stirred a deep empathy he hadn't felt in years, if ever. The fawn's side heaved, and its wide eyes shone with terror. Morgan laid a hand on its trembling flank, speaking in a soft, low voice he reserved for horses in distress. No part of him believed he could fully save the fawn. Even if he could manage some rudimentary splint, the wilds were unforgiving. But leaving it to Dim, while wolves and man stood idle, felt unthinkable. He looked over his shoulder at the alpha wolf, who watched intently, golden eyes reflecting the dappled sunlight. Morgan retrieved a small knife from his pocket. The wolf stirred but did not intervene. With careful cuts, he trimmed away some of the fawn's matted fur near the wound. It whimpered but made no attempt to struggle. Bits of broken bone were visible beneath ragged flesh, and a wave of nausea roiled Morgan's stomach. This was no clean fracture. The fawn was in severe pain, and in his heart, Morgan suspected that this was beyond saving. Yet the wolves remained poised, almost protective. He thought of the possibility that they, too, had found the fawn and recognized it could not be hunted in the usual sense. Perhaps the alpha sensed the same sort of quiet defiance in the fawn that it had once seen in Solaris. Or perhaps the pack simply recognized an odd synergy between man and beast in this place. Tears blurred Morgan's vision as he tried, with shaking hands, to improvise a brace using sturdy branches and scraps from his clothing. It was a futile effort. The fawn's breath came in shallow gasps. He heard a soft growl behind him and tensed, but it was only one of the younger wolves shifting closer, eyes fixed on the fawn's wound. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Morgan heard Solaris's distant nicker from the clearing, but he could not abandon the fawn. When he finally lifted his hand from the makeshift brace, he met the alpha wolf's gaze. A wave of understanding passed between them. They both knew the fawn's chances of survival were slim to none. In that unspoken moment, Morgan felt a ripple of guilt for ever having considered tying Solaris out for the wolves. He saw now that life in the forest wasn't about cruelty or victory. It was about balance, about recognizing one's place in a greater tapestry. The alpha wolf seemed to sense Morgan's remorse. Slowly, the imposing creature stepped forward, sniffing the fawn's braced leg. Then it bowed its head, releasing a low, mournful sound. A farewell, perhaps. The other wolves echoed this soft lament. The air vibrated with their sorrow, and Morgan realized that this was not a casual kill. It was a life that would pass, part of an endless cycle that sustained the forest. Tears slipped down Morgan's cheeks. He had never imagined wolves could mourn, or that they might grant him, a human intruder, the privilege of sharing in that grief. A hush enveloped the glen. The fawn's breathing slowed, each exhalation a fragile wisp in the cool air. Morgan felt its heartbeat flutter under his hand. The alpha wolf made no move to drive Morgan away, no attempt to claim the kill. Instead, it waited for the end of a life that had meaning within this ecosystem's grand design. Finally, the fawn's breath halted, and its eyes closed. An ineffable stillness settled. Gently, Morgan withdrew his hand, feeling both heartbreak and a strange peace. For a long moment, wolves and man knelt together, unified in the weight of that final breath. Morgan stood slowly, tears still clinging to his lashes, and stepped back. The alpha wolf looked at him, then at the fawn, and let out a weary sigh. One of the subordinate wolves crept forward, sniffing the lifeless body. The cycle would continue. What could be consumed would feed the pack, and nothing would be wasted. But this was more than raw survival. It was nature's solemn, balanced right. As Morgan turned to leave, the alpha wolf lifted its head and howled, an eerie, haunting song that echoed through the forest. The rest of the pack joined in, voices blending in a chorus that resonated with both loss and acceptance. And for the first time in his life, Morgan understood it not as a threat, but as a profound expression of connection. He retraced his steps toward the clearing where Solaris awaited, ears pricked. The horse nickered softly, as if sensing the heaviness in Morgan's soul. In the distance, the wolves' chorus faded, carrying away the spirit of the fallen fawn into the heart of the ancient woods. Somewhere in the mix of tears and forest hush, Morgan Royce felt his old self slip away. The ruthless businessman obsessed with dominance and control was eclipsed by a humbler, more reverent man who had glimpsed the unbreakable bond shared by all living things. He mounted Solaris and steered the horse back toward the estate. When he finally broke through the tree line, the sight of his sprawling mansion felt almost alien. Ornamental hedges and stone fountains seemed trite compared to the raw, unpolished sanctity of the forest. Yet he understood that returning to his old world was necessary. He carried back with him the forest's lesson, the unity he had witnessed, the tenderness and respect that even wolves and a wounded fawn could share. From that day on, Morgan knew his life would be forever changed, a new chapter shaped by an ancient truth. He owed it to Solaris, to the wolves, and perhaps even to the memory of that fawn, to bridge the gap between what he had been and what he now aspired to become. The forest's hold on him was no longer a fearful mystery. It had become a guiding presence. With the sun dipping behind the treetops, Morgan led Solaris into the barn, silently promising to protect the balance he had once threatened. The hush of twilight settled over his estate, and in the distance, a final lone howl echoed, resonating with a comforting certainty that he was not alone in this new path. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much one horse in a pack of wolves could alter a life built on pride and power. Yet from the moment the wolves spared Solaris, Morgan embarked on a journey of empathy and understanding, discovering that genuine strength lies in harmony, not domination. His estate now stands as a sanctuary, a bridge between human ambition and the forest's timeless wisdom. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary adventure. We hope this story reminds you that compassion, humility, and reverence for nature can transform even the most stubborn hearts. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What moved you the most, and how do you interpret the wolves' unexpected mercy? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel where more tales of wonder, mystery, and redemption await.